Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Mittman, and I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards here at CADTH. As the moderator for today's webinar, I wanted to first introduce myself and then start with a land acknowledgement. I think it's important as we head into our inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation tomorrow on September 30th. As part of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, there are 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of which is number 80, actually requests commemoration and calls on the federal government and in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish a statutory holiday, a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and to ensure that public commemoration of history and the legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. So for my introduction, I am a non-Indigenous settler who arrived in Canada in the early 1970s from Australia, along with my parents who came from Germany. I'm joining you today, and I'm currently located between the cities of Peterborough and Bancroft, Ontario in Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and the Anishinaabe. And I offer my gratitude to our First Nations for their care and their teachings about our earth and other relations. I'd like to encourage everyone joining today to think about where you are today and to give thanks to the people who lived here in this land before you and cared for and sustained the land where you live today. So let's lead into our CADTH lecture series. We launched the CADTH lecture series in 2014, so people from across Canada and beyond could hear directly from prominent scholars and opinion leaders about important and sometimes pressing issues facing health technology assessment and healthcare systems today. So today's lecture actually ticks all those boxes. It deals with Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia, a progressive, irreversible, and fatal brain disorder. According to the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, more than 500,000 Canadians are living with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, and 76,000 new cases of dementia are diagnosed each year. So this is an intractable and pressing problem. More specifically, today's lecture deals with aducanumab, or Aduhelm, the first new Alzheimer's treatment approved in the United States in 18 years. The US FDA approval of aducanumab in June of this year was immediately controversial, and the approval was revisited in a few weeks later. Finally, and because CADTH is involved in health technology assessment, this lecture deals with the role of health technology assessment played following the initial US FDA decision, and how policymakers and clinicians can leverage health technology assessment to better support outcomes for patients and health systems. Before I introduce our speaker, I should note that aducanumab has not been approved for use in Canada and has not been submitted to CADTH for review. However, there are still some important lessons for us to be learned from how things went with our neighbors down in the south. So let me introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Sarah Emond, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of ICER, and ICER is the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, a leading nonprofit health policy research organization in the US. Sarah began her career in clinical research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, and Sarah holds a master's degree in public policy with a concentration in health policy from the Heller School of Brandeis University, and received a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from Smith College. Sarah, thank you for presenting today, and I'm turning it over to you.
Nicole, thank you so much. And my thanks to CADTH for inviting me to be here today and for spending some time talking about this really controversial, important issue. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the United States with the approval of aducanumab, or Aduhelm. And then I'm going to tell you about what my organization did, ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And we'll end by sort of looking forward. Where do we go from here? Well, first, a little bit about ICER for those who aren't familiar. We are an independent nonprofit. We are considered a health technology assessment group, which is wonderful that on this webinar, one of the few where I don't actually have to define what that is. But I will point out, most of you know this, we don't have centralized health technology assessment in the US. And so as an independent nonprofit, I often joke, we don't have any regulatory authority. No one needs to listen to a darn thing we say, but we contribute to this national conversation about how we pay for healthcare with limited resources. Our process is distinctive in the US system by doing this in a very public form. So for the last 15 plus years, we have this process. It takes about 8 months. We'll look at a new technology. We will make a determination about comparative clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and value, and then convene a regional council of experts in evidence-based medicine and patient and consumer experience to keep us honest about our results and our conclusions, and make some votes that inform the policy that will then be made about access and price. A lot of our analyses don't shy away from that important question of cost effectiveness, and we issue health benefit price benchmarks. A distinction between ICER's approach and what happens in a single payer healthcare system is we are making recommendations about what represents a fair price based on the evidence that the manufacturer has been able to produce. This is not a should we cover it or should we not cover it question, as sometimes happens in some HTA organizations. I'll mention 2 other things that we do very quickly here because they're projects that are near and dear to my heart. We also take a look at how price increases that happen year over year are impacting healthcare spending and when those price increases aren't justified by new evidence of benefit for patients. And this fall, we'll issue our very first fair access report, where we judged the 15 largest commercial formularies in the US about how well they're giving access to patients for fairly priced drugs, right? Paradigm here, the grand bargain. The fair price is there, that means patients should be getting fair access. My disclosures are tied to ICER's funding. I personally don't hold any stocks, consulting, anything in healthcare concerns generally. ICER's research is entirely funded by nonprofit foundations, the largest of which is Arnold Ventures. We also get money from the California Healthcare Foundation, the Donahue Family Foundation, the Kaiser Foundation. We do accept money from manufacturers and payers, but that money only supports a policy summit and other related activities that bring leaders together to tackle a big issue in evidence-based medicine. And this might seem really familiar to those of you who've worked in HTA, who've worked in this space before. The crux of what we do is about facilitating a national conversation about access to healthcare and fair prices. And we believe that doing so means everyone's got to be at the table. So each of our public meetings, our reviews involve the manufacturers of the technology, involve the patient and the major patient advocacy organizations for that disease area. We also talk to consumer advocacy who are thinking about things maybe a little bit differently than patient advocacy, health plans, policymakers. We believe that only in this open conversation are we able to move to a more just healthcare system. Many of us are refugees from an academic background, and we left that setting because we really wanted the work we were doing to have practical application. So all of the work that we do is in service to supporting evidence-based policymaking. And at the end of the day, we do what we do because patients don't get access to the care they need now because of cost. And we're trying to light the path to show how we can have broad access to fairly priced drugs in a sustainable healthcare system. Just a choice that we can make. All right, so why are we talking about aducanumab today? Perhaps I don't need to tell you because you've been watching the news and you've been reading about this, but it is fair to say that this was an unprecedented approval from the US Food and Drug Administration. It had a couple of things that were unprecedented. They ignored a nearly unanimous vote from its advisory committee that said we should not approve this drug, we should do another trial to decide and to see what the data showed about whether it worked. In the FDA system, the advisory committee votes are non-binding, but we could not come up with an example of when there was a unanimous vote against, and there was one abstention, and the FDA went ahead and approved anyway. They applied something called the accelerated approval pathway retroactively. The accelerated approval pathway is an important regulatory pathway in the US designed to help speed access to drugs for serious conditions with unmet need. And it allows the sponsor to use a surrogate endpoint. You don't have to show clinical benefit. You just got to say, is this endpoint likely to have a benefit for patients? And then there's a commitment to do another study after approval to see if the clinical benefit is there. I am not aware of the accelerated approval pathway being applied retroactively at the time of approval. This is something that typically sponsors and FDA negotiate about for a very long time. Phase 2, phase 3, and up to the filing of the new drug application. The third thing they did was they said, well, we're going to use this accelerated approval pathway and we're going to use amyloid clearance as the surrogate endpoint for having a reasonable likelihood of predicting clinical benefit. They did so after publicly saying they would not. Okay, so that's why this has gotten a lot of attention. When the FDA does a couple of things it's never done before, a lot of people are interested to understand why. And asking those questions has led to some investigative journalism from STAT that's exposed some possibly improper coordination between the FDA and Biogen. There are currently 2 congressional investigations and an inspector general investigation to explore this issue. What really bums me out at the end of the day about all of this is it seems like we've left patients and their families to fend for themselves. In fact, a senior leader at the FDA said that ultimately the decision of whether or not to use the drug is up to patients, their families, and their healthcare professionals. And I gotta be honest, I was stunned when I read this because I thought the FDA was there to make sure that only safe and effective drugs were available as a safeguard against claims of efficacy where there are none. I am not one of those people who wants to go back to a sort of right to try approach for pharmaceutical products and anything else for that matter. I think that the days of snake oil salesmen are something that we should not return to. And so this was a stunning statement that was made by the leader of the FDA around this approval. Now we're going to nerd out about the science because I have a feeling a bunch of you are interested in the science. So let's talk about what we know. And all of the next few slides come from the research that our team did over, actually it was a little more than an 8-month process. I say there at the bottom because we extended this because that deadline got extended a couple of times of the review period from the FDA, involving the major stakeholders from the patient side, the manufacturer themselves, and other important stakeholders. So what do we know? Aducanumab is a monoclonal antibody targeting beta amyloid. It's administered by an IV every 4 weeks. We have 2 phase 3 studies, Engage and Emerge. If you're going to write anything down today, write down those 2 things because what they showed is the crux of why we're still talking about this approval months later. They were stopped for futility. The Drug Safety Monitoring Board, I think it was the DSMB, said there's just no chance this is going to show the endpoint. We need to stop it. But a few months later, Biogen reanalyzed what they were finding because there was additional data that were accumulated even after the trials were stopped for futility. They filed for approval. FDA granted that approval in June of 2021, again, using the accelerated approval pathway retroactively. And then after some additional reaction to a label that basically said this was available and appropriate for anyone with Alzheimer's disease, they said it should be initiated only in those with mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's disease, which was representative of the patient population in Engage and Emerge. We held our public meeting after our extensive review in July, so it was after approval. So what do we know about these 2 trials? We know that they look awfully similar, if not identical, in terms of age, the follow-up time, how many patients, the proportion of mild and mild AD and MCI. And we make this point because of what I'm going to show you on the next few slides, which is, spoiler alert, These two trials showed very different results, which is not what you would expect a priori, right? You would do two identical trials, pivotal trials for a phase 3 program, expecting, if not identical, at least directionally similar, if not identical results. Well, what do we do? What we do know, and here's what you might expect to see. You can see in ENGAGE and EMERGE, what we're looking at here is the reduction in amyloid. All right, so blue is placebo. And over the course of the trial, we see that the amyloid plaques didn't really change. Great, that's what you would sort of expect if you're using a monoclonal antibody that improves amyloid clearance. And orange, low dose, we see a reduction in amyloid. Excellent. And then gray, high dose, we see an even further reduction. Okay, great. At this point, this is working exactly as I would expect a priori. A higher dose, more amyloid removed, fantastic. I'll pause here to say that if this drug had had the accelerated approval pathway applied to it from the very beginning, and it was very clear to the community that the endpoint we were worried about was amyloid reduction, I don't think you would have invited me to talk today because there wouldn't really be a lot of controversy. But the controversy was around that these studies were powered to look at slowing of decline in cognitive function. And those were the primary endpoints agreed upon for the trials. And here's what we saw. So in EMERGE, you see it here. We've got the black line placebo, the blue line low dose, the red line high dose. They're trending how you would expect, except maybe here in the beginning, high dose isn't doing quite as well. You want to see lower on this scale. You want to see a really flat curve here because that means you're slowing decline, right? So you're cognitively getting worse the higher up on this scale you go. So again, I'll pause. If they just had EMERGE, if they didn't have a second trial, you'd go, okay, this is matching what I'm seeing in the amyloid clearance. And here we are, we're seeing this reduction. But they had two trials. And the other trial was from ENGAGE. And ENGAGE, we see exactly the opposite, that the fastest decline in cognitive ability actually came from the high dose. So there's a bunch of you in the audience, I'm sure, who have taken many classes and probably taught some classes on what do you do when you've got two phase 3 trials in a clinical trial program that have conflicting results. The answer is you don't know which one is truth. And so you have to do another one, right? So this is the basis of evidence-based medicine, is that we need to go in with an a priori expectation and then look at what the data tell us. And so when these data are analyzed and talked about, and at our public meeting, our expert panel, the clinical experts that we consulted, all agreed that it was very difficult to say what this drug actually does from the perspective of slowing cognitive decline. But here's the thing. We do have really good data about what it does on the harm side. So amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, or ARIA, can happen from swelling or from bleeding. And with the highest dose, the 10 milligrams per kilogram dose, we saw high rates of ARIA. Importantly, most of them were asymptomatic and were diagnosed only by MRI because getting screening MRIs was part of the protocol for the clinical trials. Most resolved, more common with those with a particular genetic predisposition. And the discontinuation rate, which is something that all clinical trial scientists look at to know how critical a side effect is, was 9%. All right, it's not 50%, it's not 1%, we got 9% here. But what we do know is clearly you can expect patients getting, aducanumab have a high likelihood of experiencing ARIA. There are open questions about whether or not this sort of matters in the grand scheme of things. If most are asymptomatic and they resolve with a brief interruption in therapy, maybe this isn't a big deal. This was the crux of an important conversation at our public meeting because of what we know about what happens when people go into the community. they may not be getting those screening MRIs as often as those in a clinical trial. Caregivers and their families might not be watching for the signs in a way that caregivers and families who are participating in a clinical trial may. It also could turn out it's not as bad as we think, and that most of these cases aren't really a big deal. There's no symptoms and they resolve. The other thing I will note that's important was a limitation of the enrollment in the trials was you couldn't be on blood thinners. And we do know that a large portion of the Medicare population, which is where most of our Alzheimer's patients are in the US, are on blood thinners. And there is a lot of worry that this could be a lot worse in a patient with blood thinners. And so I think most clinical experts are agreeing that this is not an appropriate therapy for people who are getting that kind of coagulation therapy. So as we look at what happened, the manufacturer and the FDA looked to reconcile these two conflicting trial results. It appears from the communications that we have publicly from the FDA and from the manufacturer that everyone sort of started from the premise that the positive trial was truth, or MERGE. They did do some post hoc subgroup and group analyses based on the dosage and did some other things. And they ended up focusing on fewer patients in ENGAGE having received the full dose because of the differing timing in the protocol change that allowed the higher dosing. And so interestingly, eMERGE started just 1 month after ENGAGE. And 29% of patients in eMERGE and 22% of patients in ENGAGE received the high dose. And so again, if you believe that eMERGE is truth, the positive trial, the fact that they had a higher percentage of patients receiving the high dose could explain why there was a positive effect in that trial and why there wasn't one in ENGAGE. You could. Or you could believe that there were conflicting results and we need a third trial to know what the truth is, right? So ultimately, we came down to the conclusion that it's really difficult to draw any conclusion about what this drug does on a clinical benefit perspective because of the conflicting results. The post hoc and an explanation of the dosing between 29% and 22% having the higher dose, in our opinion, seems unlikely to explain why eMERGE did better than ENGAGE. There was also some talk of functional unblinding due to ARIA explaining some of the difference in the two trials. We've also deemed that explanation is unlikely to explain why we ended up with such conflicting results from two identical phase 3 trials. We also talked a lot about how this amyloid hypothesis might just be wrong. Right? And so we'll talk about this a little bit later. To me, this is one of the biggest and most important questions coming out of this experience, because we know how public markets work. We know how commercial drug discovery works. Money will go where you think you can get FDA approval. We have now shown that an amyloid hypothesis, an amyloid surrogate endpoint, can lead to FDA approval. There's a lot of concern that we've now incentivized a lot of innovation around the amyloid hypothesis at the expense of examining whether or not it's right. At the very least, it's incomplete, right? Because if those two trials, think back to those PET scans I showed you, showed the almost identical reduction in amyloid that had differing impact on what actually matters to patients and their family, which is slowing cognitive decline. So we deemed the clinical significance, even of the eMERGE findings, is very uncertain. This is something that came up a lot in our public meeting. A lot of the conversation about those who are pushing for access to aducanumab, who think that it should be up to patients, and they were saying things like, it can improve Alzheimer's disease. Let's be very clear. What we found in eMERGE was it slowed cognitive decline. Nobody got better, right? So even the clinical significance of the positive trial in terms of what it means for patients and their families is really uncertain. And as I mentioned earlier, worries that ARIA could be worse with less careful monitoring. Another important point here, we know that a large portion of the population that suffers from Alzheimer's disease in the United States are Black and Brown communities. And the representation of those communities in the clinical trial was lacking. And so drawing conclusions about how wide-scale use of aducanumab may impact health disparities is a very open question because we don't have the data to know whether or not there's a differential impact on Black and Brown communities. With all of this in mind, we rated ICER's evidence rating as insufficient, or I, saying we just don't have enough data to say whether or not aducanumab helps Alzheimer's patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia. So then we talked about the cost effectiveness. And Nicole and I were just laughing about this before we got on here, because you have to start cost effectiveness by thinking about effectiveness and the clinical effectiveness. So I could have a really short presentation in this section, right? If you believe that the evidence is insufficient, we can't decide, we don't know whether or not this drug works. The cost effectiveness analysis is really easy because it's zero. Right? So if it hasn't proven it actually improves patients' lives in a meaningful way, then that's an easy calculation. But we did a cost effectiveness analysis, and I'm going to tell you why. Because it is approved, and because patients, their families, and those who pay for healthcare are being asked whether or not they should be giving access to this drug, and the fact that the manufacturer has picked a price, means that we, and in service to our mission, deserve to do an analysis that shows what a fair price would be. So, okay, how do you do that? Again, if you don't think there's enough evidence to show the drug works, what we did is, despite that uncertainty, we approached it by pooling the results from Emerge and Engage in the best estimates of what actually was happening. There was a lot of assumptions we needed to make because of lack of data from the trials and from the manufacturer. We don't know what happens to patients who transition from moderate to severe or even mild to moderate. Okay, so here are a few of the changes that we made to our model in order to capture our best assumption for what happens to a patient on aducanumab. We said there's no benefit in slowing decline from moderate to severe. We talked to clinical experts, prior trials. There was no expectation that someone who had a slowing of decline of mild to moderate would have any decline from moderate to severe. But we did assume that the benefit was from mild to moderate was half that seen for mild cognitive impairment to mild Alzheimer's. So said another way, if the cascade is mild cognitive impairment to mild AD to moderate AD, we said that the transition from mild AD to moderate AD was half of what we saw from MCI to mild. These are some pretty high cost effectiveness ratios. We did our analysis on the traditional cost for quality adjusted life year gained. We also have an alternative metric called the equal value life year gained that values all of the extension of life for any life extending product the same, regardless of age or disability status. And you can see here that we're talking about ICERs in the millions at the list price of $56,000 a year, which is the price that Biogen picked. If you take the societal perspective, things get a little bit better because you can see that there is an impact on caregivers in particular as they as cognitive decline slows, right? As people with Alzheimer's disease are able to do their activities of daily living, we can see how there's another impact outside of just that healthcare system perspective, but we're still talking about incredibly high incremental cost effectiveness ratios. Like any good health economist, we also went out and did some sensitivity analyses and some scenarios. And so we did an optimistic scenario using only the data from the positive trial. And we assumed that it worked just as well for mild Alzheimer's as it does for mild cognitive impairment, still not cost effective. In those analyses, the cost effectiveness ratios were still quite high. We're looking at prices more like $11,000 to $23,000 in order to be considered a fair value. And what really mattered when we did all of our sensitivity analyses was how well the drug works. That was the one thing that drove the results. So where you are on the spectrum of how much should Biogen charge for this drug depends on how much you believe the data that were produced. So again, if you believe there is no value or there is no clinical benefit, then a fair price is pretty much zero. If you believe that eMERGE is truth, and that is the only trial that matters, you're looking at a value-based price of $11,000 to $23,000. We did talk with patients and their families about other benefits and contextual considerations, things that are difficult to put into a cost effectiveness model, but are important for policymakers to consider when making decisions. And universally, and we actually didn't, I gotta be honest, we didn't have to talk to many people because we all know people and have people in our family. This is a substantial population level unmet need. I think it's another explanation for why this has gotten the attention that it's gotten. When you have something with such high severity, the magnitude of burden for patients and caregivers, it gives extra attention to the fact that we don't have effective treatments for something so serious. We also heard from patients and their families that bringing a patient with cognitive impairment to a monthly infusion and additional imaging monitoring could be really tough. Depending on the individual, depending on the family and their circumstances. And I want to emphasize how disappointing it is that we have no idea what this would do to health inequities. And the fact that we don't have enough data to know what this drug is doing for those from Black and Brown communities. All of that together, our judgment of a fair price, again, assuming the pooling of the results from eMERGE and ENGAGE, is $3,000 to $8,400 a year. We could spend another 40 minutes talking about potential budget impact, but let me just tell you this, it's big, right? So some of the estimates that have come out right at approval in terms of looking at the eligible population had estimates that spending by Medicare on this one drug would outpace how much Medicare spends on all other drugs that it pays for through what's called Part B, the physician and hospital administered drugs. So those are real numbers. And this is another part of our process that we take very seriously, is again, facilitating this conversation about how we pay for healthcare with limited resources. When we're talking about a price chosen by a manufacturer so far out of line with the value they've been able to demonstrate through their own clinical trials, that potential budget impact, that circumstance where CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, would have to use resources from other priorities in order to pay for a drug with questionable efficacy, I think is at the crux of why we're still talking about aducanumab months later. So we have, I think, covered pretty extensively here our conclusion that we don't have enough evidence to know whether or not there's a benefit for patients. And it could be that the best explanation for why we saw conflicting evidence is that it's due to chance. And there's no particular reason to think the positive trial is more likely to be correct than the negative trial. There are, however, known harms. There is no question about that, but we will acknowledge we don't know what the long-term impact of ARIA is. Given the standard combination of results of the two trials that we went through, the reasonable price would be approximately 1/10 of the current list price. And even if you just consider that positive trial, as we showed, aducanumab is significantly overpriced. We took all of this information and we sat with the Alzheimer's Association, the representatives from the neurology community, payers, the manufacturer, and we said, here are some guideposts for where we go from here. We fully believe, and it's a key part of our mission, to emphasize that fair pricing is part of a social contract, right? Manufacturers with their monopoly pricing power have an obligation to think about the societal impact of those decisions. And we worry that this type of overreach on price has created an incredible amount of financial toxicity. And we also know that there are a lot of health plans and health systems that are choosing not to cover this drug. So now we're in a situation where those who are able to write a check for $56,000 can get this drug, but not those who have to rely on health insurance. So this further is exacerbating health disparities and falling really hardest on our most vulnerable patients. We also called on the manufacturer to work with communities of color to ensure that diverse populations are represented in the clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease. And this is not just for Biogen. We have several companies pursuing filings for monoclonal antibodies that attack the amyloid plaques, and it's on all of them to make sure that these trials are representative of those who actually have Alzheimer's disease. We did call specifically on Biogen to speed up its confirmatory trial. The timeline offered by the FDA was 10 years to do a confirmatory trial. And we think that is way too long while we all wait to know whether or not this drug works. We did go so far in our policy recommendations to say that it would be reasonable for health plans and the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services not to cover the drug because there's insufficient evidence of benefit, but we do know there are harms. And we called on the FDA and other regulators to be very judicious in the use of clinical endpoints in accelerated approval pathway approvals to make sure that they're reasonably likely to benefit patients, because there are significant open questions on whether or not that is true in this case. So what happened after approval in our meeting? 3 members of the FDA advisory committee resigned. I am also not aware of that ever happening. Some of them were very public with their reasoning about how it was an abdication of the FDA's responsibility to patients to approve a drug with no known benefit, but with known harms. Several major health systems have refused to prescribe it, including Mount Sinai, the Cleveland Clinic, the VA, and just yesterday, Mass General Brigham, the largest healthcare system in Massachusetts. Now, CMS has announced that it's doing a national coverage determination. I think we're about halfway through, so in a couple of months, we're going to see that draft. CMS has some choices. It could decide not to cover it. It could decide to cover it for certain populations. You could decide to cover it, but require people be enrolled in a trial to make sure that we can continue to gather evidence about whether or not aducanumab is effective. In the meantime, most major health plans are waiting for that CMS decision before they come out and say what they're going to do about coverage. And we did just learn a couple of days ago that we only about 100 prescriptions have been reported by Biogen through September 11th. So let's just bring this back as we close today about sort of the thesis of this talk today, which is why do we need a health technology assessment? We get that question a lot. Americans aren't really used to HTA. It's not something that they're familiar with. After FDA approval, sort of ready access to a drug, regardless of price, has been sort of MO of a lot of Americans. Why do we need it? Because we were able, and I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but you can get a sense of the variety here, whether it was the clinical community, the patient community, policymakers themselves. We were able to provide an independent evaluation of the evidence. We were able to do that in a transparent public discussion with all of the key stakeholders in the room, in the Zoom room in this case. By bringing that independent evaluation and that public process together, we're able to demonstrate to the US healthcare system what a fair price could look like in order to have a more sustainable healthcare system that does not overpay for drugs with limited benefit. And with those stakeholders, come up with these guidelines for coverage and future research, some of which I mentioned previously. So as I close today, and I'm really excited for the questions, I think that what I have learned by living through this experience just personally is that there are ways that our healthcare system can have courage in protection and service to patients. And sometimes that role is really hard. And sometimes there are slings and arrows. But I could not be prouder of the work that the team at ICER did around this approval in particular. Because like I said earlier, every single one of us has had a family member either with or who's passed away from Alzheimer's. And every single one of us is waiting for that treatment that will help maybe us or our brothers as we get older. And we had a system that in my mind was incentivizing all of the wrong things, because we still don't know if this drug works. We don't know if the amyloid hypothesis is correct. And now I have worries about where we're headed with future Alzheimer's research. All right, I ended on a way more downer note than I expected, Nicole. So this Q&A, we're gonna bring it back more positive.
Well, I mean, thank you thank you very much, Sarah, for the great and very energetic presentation. And you have some questions in the Q&A section that are really quite keen on the way you presented the information. So, I wanted to just highlight that we have some time for questions. And if you have a question, for those of you who are online for our speaker, please use the Q&A tab in the Zoom control bar, and we'll take as many questions as we can. I think I learned a couple of things today. The term academic refugee was something that resonated with me. But maybe I can start off, and we're a health technology assessment agency. We often get those questions too about why do we need health technology assessment? But one of the things that you talked about, but maybe you could spend a little bit more time elaborating on is, how did the patient and consumer groups play a role in ensuring some of the value or some of the discussion that you've had about this particular product?
I want to make comments and call out two groups in particular with acknowledgement that there are many Alzheimer's patient groups in the US doing a lot of work, but Us Against Alzheimer's and the Alzheimer's Association were involved in our review from the very beginning. Us Against Alzheimer's in particular did a fantastic job helping us identify sources of information on things that weren't in the clinical trial from Biogen, or at least give more color commentary to those things. Things like caregiver burden, like what does meaningful impact actually mean for caregivers? I will say that in my experience, a lot of organized patient advocacy in the US don't make comments about the prices chosen by manufacturers. And there's a lot of reasons for that. They focus a lot of their advocacy on reducing out-of-pocket costs for patients with their condition, which is a totally noble cause. The Alzheimer's Association did issue a statement saying that the price was unconscionable, I believe was the word that they used. And I commend them for doing that and highlighting the worries they had about how this was going to exacerbate disparities and actually further harm vulnerable populations. In general, the patients that came to our meeting, some with mild cognitive impairment in the early stages of Alzheimer's, and the caregivers that we heard from made an incredible impact on our voting council and on all of us as human beings. And the patient advocacy involvement in this review, in my opinion, was stellar in terms of the impact it had on us and on the research and the decisions we made in the entire process.
Thanks very much. It just shows the value of patient impact and engagement. Maybe I can turn to the clinician side. We have a question in our Q&A that asks about providing additional insights into how ICER integrates clinicians into this review process.
Absolutely, yeah, great question.
Yeah, sorry, and it's like, I'm trying to get to your answer as fast as possible. But providing, additional details like stakeholder engagement process.
Yeah. The benefit, I don't know if it's bad design, the benefit of an ICER process is we take public comment at several different points in our process from anyone who wants to. And so we generally do get a fair amount of comments from clinical experts, clinical societies, patients, their families, the manufacturers, and others with interest. In this particular case, we benefited from consulting with clinical experts, several of whom were actually involved in the clinical trial. And so they had firsthand experience with administering the drug, like handling RAF, and they were consulted throughout the entire process. Before an ICER draft is posted for public comment, it does go through a review from a clinical expert. This is something we added to our process because we are experts in general evidence-based medicine. We are not experts in each of the disease areas that we work in. And so we make sure that that's supplemented, beginning with scoping, but all the way through that draft report. And then a clinical expert or two sit front and center at the public meeting in order to make sure that the clinical perspective is represented when we're getting questions from our independent panel to give additional color commentary to things that we hear from patients and their families. And so the clinical experts are involved. And in this case, the Academy of Neurology, American Academy of Neurology, was quite clear in its statement about how they thought that this approval was inappropriate and premature, and also pointing to the analysis that we did from an evidence-based medicine perspective.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Maybe my next question is, will this drug, aducanumab, bring more attention and focus on the implementation or the usefulness or the value of health technology assessment in the future for the US in general?
Jury is still out. That's a great question. I think I will not gloss over the fact that the existence of health technology assessment causes consternation and fear and some distrust in certain elements of the healthcare system. I'm going to acknowledge that. It's different. There's a lot of misinformation that gets spread about what it does do and what it doesn't do. And we often talk about how we're a uniquely American solution to our uniquely American healthcare system. I joked earlier that no one has to do a darn thing we say. We don't have any regulatory authority. We're just trying to foster a public conversation about these important issues. I do think there's the possibility that the independent analysis of evidence and the public convening that we're able to do is filling an important need in the US healthcare system. And if we do see an influx of approvals with less and less evidence, you might see more and more stakeholders looking to an ICER or another value assessment group for guidance on what to do. The biggest thing we hear from people is not, oh, hey, thanks. I really needed this piece of information in order to do what I already wanted to do, right? I wanted to say no to this drug, or I wanted to ask for a big rebate, or whatever it might be. What we hear is, we don't have resources to do this type of analysis. We got rapid fire, new technologies, and what are we going to do? Thank you for fostering a public conversation and then producing this information so that we can incorporate it into our decision making. I don't think that's going away.
Thanks. Maybe I can add, there are a couple more questions that I wanted to highlight here, and I know our time is running short, so I just wanted to make sure that we ask them some targeted questions. Can you comment on how you included some of the health and human resource factors, specialists available, which might be very different in terms of access from the US to the Canadian perspective, machines available, all of those kinds of things. Were they considered as part of your review as well?
That is a great question. That is something that we acknowledge is more traditionally done when health technology assessment is done in a single payer healthcare system, because you have insight into all of that. You know exactly how many specialists, what the wait times are, what can I get, how can I get people into MRI machines? Those conversations come up, but don't come up in the same way, in my experience, as they do in some other countries that are really thinking about this more holistically. The ways that we have talked about it have been in these sort of contextual considerations, other benefits, or it can come out in our public roundtable. I will say it wasn't a major factor in this review in terms of access to that care infrastructure. I have had that experience in other reviews. CAR-T was one of the biggest ones where we actually judged the value of the CAR-T therapies for severe blood cancers to be high value. And there was a lot from the patient community that I said, that's great. There's like 4 places in the country where I can get it. And like, we've got issues with access in terms of getting to those places. And so that was a contextual consideration that we had to address. I will say that one of the things about the infrastructure that came up was more around the other things we do to treat Alzheimer's and whether or not the existence of aducanumab would take resources away from those other things. One of the geriatricians on our panel actually said, we have great evidence that moderate exercise slows cognitive decline. It's like, I could hire every Alzheimer's patient a personal trainer for $56,000 a year, and I'd have an actual measurable improvement. And here I am with a drug which I don't know will actually help my patients. And that was very striking to me.
Great answer. I have one more question that I wanted to ask you, and then we'll slowly wrap up, although I feel like we can talk about this for another couple hours. So the question is, how do you allow systems to be creative and make brave but smart decisions as you've done here? Health technology assessment can be too rigid and rule-oriented to the detriment of those making creative and brave, smart solutions or decisions. Do you have any suggestions for this?
Oh, what an awesome question. And I definitely don't want to be seen as rigid. I think what we often think of ourselves as guides, where we are here to show options. And a health system could decide on its own, using its own analysis, its own pharmacy and therapeutics committee, that it makes sense to offer this drug in this case. What we're showing with health technology assessment is we're now guiding that health system, whether it's a hospital or maybe an integrated system like Kaiser, what represents a fair price, so that they have a touch point in order to really tap into that creativity, right? So instead of the starting point being the price chosen by the manufacturer who has a government granted monopoly, the starting point of the conversation can be something like an independent HTA. And so it isn't about saying no or yes to the access, it's saying it at what price. And it should be, I hope that it's giving health systems that foundation, because when we do that across disease areas, then we have abundant resources for the high value care and for that creativity. It's the system we have now that has a starting point that's what the market will bear without justification for how it ties to clinical benefit for patients, that takes away our ability to be creative. Because all we're doing at that point is just trying to figure out how to make our budget work. And so it creates this like arms race, like higher and higher prices and like bigger and bigger rebates and access restriction. I'm going to put another prior auth and another utilization management on it. And all of that, patients lose. And so I would hope that the existence of this independent analysis can inspire and contribute to the creativity that healthcare systems have about access to new technologies.
And that's almost your final thought, but I'm going to ask you one more thing. You know, we're almost out of time, and so we'll have to wrap up, but I have to say that there's been a really robust question and answer period going on in the background here. So I've tried to get to some of the questions. Apologies, I tried to theme some of them for you as well. But maybe before we go, Sarah, do you have a chance to leave us with some parting thoughts before we wrap up in total?
Yes, thank you. The work we do in health technology assessment is really important, and it matters. And I feel really fortunate that I get to do the work that I do, because that I know it's in service to an ideal. We can have a healthcare system where access is there for patients when the prices align with the benefit that manufacturers can prove, and then you got plenty of money and incentive for that next round of amazing innovation that we want. And I think that we get stuck thinking that sometimes we have to just be okay with the status quo. And so I would say that being able to do this work and bring the expertise of those who understand evidence-based medicine, who understand comparative effectiveness research and comparative value, is a privilege. And that I hope that you all doing this work feel similarly, because At the end of the day, there are a number of unseen patients in our healthcare system who suffer when costs go up and access is restricted. And we can light the path forward so that we can have a system that allows that access at a price that we can all afford.
Well, on that note, I really would like to say this brings us to an end of today's session, and a really big thank you to our guest lecturer, Sarah Emond, certainly for her talk today, her energy, and I'm sure we'll ask you back to come and talk to us again. Thanks also to everyone, so be careful what you wish for, Sarah. Thanks also to everyone who tuned in for today's webinar. Well, for those of you who attended, there'll be a short evaluation survey, which will open in a new window when you exit the Zoom. Please, for us, take a moment to fill it out. It helps us learn and helps us actually create presentations that are of value to our audience. And then maybe a final plug, the CADTH Symposium is coming up in a month's time. Can't believe that it's a month's time from now. Please visit the CADTH website for information on the symposium and for any upcoming events that we have. Until next time, continue to follow safety protocols, protect yourself, your loved ones, and your community. And thank you for joining us today.